Let's get started. Thank you, everybody, for getting up early, coming out. I know it's the first talk of the day. It's hard to get out of bed, but I've got some really cool stuff to show you today about Aurelia. I've got some brand new stuff that hasn't been publicly shown off yet until today. So thanks for getting out here. First off, who am I? Who here has used Aurelia? Okay, a few of you. So if you've used Aurelia, you've probably seen me. My name's Ashley Grant. I'm Aurelia's community lead. Also, I love cars, and I'm a pilot. And if someone could please explain to me this whole thing with, I thought what I call French fries are called chips here, but the other night at the restaurant, they called them French fries, and I'm completely confused now. So if after the talk, someone that's from Britain could explain this to me, I would love it. Thank you. So today we're going to talk about, first off, what is Aurelia? I'm going to show you a demo, give you an idea of how to work with Aurelia, how easy it is to use Aurelia. Then I've got the new stuff there, a little bit of a surprise for you. I'm going to talk about the current status of the framework and show you where we're moving as a framework. So first off, what is Aurelia? The most important thing to understand about Aurelia is that it is just JavaScript, okay? We write our own source code in standard ES 2015 JavaScript. If you go look at the source code, you'll see that there are types in it. It's not TypeScript. Those are just flow types that help us generate our DTS files for those of you who are using TypeScript. But the great thing is we don't force you to choose a language with Aurelia. If you want to use TypeScript, you can use it. If you want to use ES 2015, you can use it. If you want to use ES 2015 plus new features that are coming down the pipe, I like to call that ES Next, you're able to use that. We built Aurelia as a collection of collaborating libraries, which means that the framework code is not monolithic. We have a bunch of repos on GitHub that come together to form the framework. The nice thing about this is that you can take parts of the framework and utilize them in your own. Say if you were writing a Node.js application and you needed dependency injection for that application, you can take our dependency injection provider and utilize it in your own code. But the cooler thing about us building the framework as a set of libraries is that you can swap these libraries out, okay? Say you currently have an Angular 1 or a Knockout application with tons of views, and you would like to translate that application into Aurelia, but you want to concentrate on rewriting your JavaScript and not on rewriting your views, you can actually swap out our templating and binding libraries and teach Aurelia how to work with a Knockout view or with an Angular 1 view or even an Angular 2 view. It also means that you can teach Aurelia new things by plugging into it. For example, loading React components. You're able to do that with Aurelia because of the architecture of the framework. As you might expect with something built in just JavaScript, it's used to build JavaScript clients. Single-page applications is what we call those. A couple years ago, that meant applications that ran in a browser. Nowadays, it doesn't mean that anymore. As a JavaScript developer, you can write applications that run everywhere. In the browser, on the desktop, using something like Electron. Who's built an Electron application and been blown away at how easy it is to get started with that and how quick you can create a distributable application, self-updating. I love it. And you can do that. You can use Aurelia with Electron. Also, on mobile, PhoneGap or Apache Cordova, you can use Aurelia to build mobile applications. And it's really nice because if you architect your application's views correctly, you could actually use the same code base and same views across all three spaces. It's really nice. The thing that makes Aurelia different from most of the other competing frameworks, because I realize there are hundreds of frameworks out there for you to choose from, but the thing that makes Aurelia different is that we focus on using standards, the modern DOM web components technology. Web components are an emerging set of standards that will allow you to build componentized applications completely within the browser without needing a JavaScript library. And that's awesome. Problem is, there's some warts on these specifications, and Aurelia helps smooth those over, okay? But the cool thing is, Once we finish some work we have going on, you'll be able to export an Aurelia component as a standard web component, a standard HTML custom element, and use that anywhere you want. Use it on a vanilla JS page, or use it in, say, a React app or an Angular 2 app. You'll be able to do that, okay? We also, as the slide says, focus on using the modern DOM. Who here has heard that the DOM is slow, and so we need to build a virtual DOM? Yeah, a couple of you. That used to be true. It isn't today. Modern 2015, 2016, 2017 browsers, the DOM is really, really fast. And if you know what you're doing, you can write JavaScript applications that are very fast, and you don't have to go through a layer with the virtual DOM. And so that's what you get with Aurelia. We focus on making things fast for you. We have a lot of very smart people on our team, and they know how to eke every bit of performance out of the browser. So the philosophy of Aurelia, first off, we're open source, we're MIT licensed, we are free, we always will be free. But more important than that is that we focus on clean code and conventions. When I say clean code, you go look at our source code for the framework, and it's very clean, it's very readable. But more important than that is that our conventions encourage you to write clean code. When you write an Aurelia application, the framework gets out of your way. And because of that, you're able to focus on your own code, your own application's logic. Okay? You're not littering your code with a bunch of boilerplate for the framework. So your code becomes cleaner. We use modern tooling, such as NPM and Yarn and everything. We build our tooling on top of that. We have a CLI now that we're working on that utilizes all of this and brings it together so that you're utilizing familiar tooling as a JavaScript developer. And also, we like to focus on what we call the ilities: testability, maintainability, extensibility. Because the framework gets out of your way and allows you to focus on writing your own code, that makes your code that much more testable because you're not having to mock up a bunch of constructs from the framework. Because you're not having to write a bunch of framework code, that makes your own code more maintainable. If there's less code to maintain, it's going to be more maintainable. And also, the framework itself is extremely extensible. As I just said, you can teach the framework how to parse and render a knockout JS view or an Angular 1 view, okay? I have demos that I've shown off where we teach Aurelia how to render into a markdown document. Think of how powerful that is, that you're not tied to just one single view implementation. And also, we are experiencing rapid adoption in a large active community. I can tell you I was at NDC Sydney a couple months ago, and I gave this talk, and there was a lot fewer people in the room. Okay? And I think after the stuff I show off today, we're going to have even more people coming on board. Okay? If you go check out our Gitter channel, gitter.im/Aurelia/discuss, you'll see thousands of people from around the world discussing Aurelia, getting help with Aurelia problems. If you go to Stack Overflow, like me, and subscribe to Aurelia questions on Stack Overflow, your email inbox is going to get blown up with people asking because there's that many people using Aurelia. We often hear about the other major players in the framework world, and you think that there isn't other options, but there are, and there's tons of people out there utilizing Aurelia to build amazing applications. Now, next we're going to get into my demos, and if you'd like to follow along or you want to try this out when you get home, you can go and download one of our beginner kits. These are really great because you download a zip file, and then you unzip it, and you can immediately run this thing. It will transpile all of your code in the browser, which obviously isn't good for production. But for just playing around, this is really nice to get started without having to go and install NPM and know all of those commands and everything and understand what's going on. You can just open up this thing and start coding, especially if you have Firefox. Just open index.html, and then in a text editor of your choice, start editing files and keep hitting refresh. Really nice. But for me today, I'm going to be utilizing our Aurelia CLI, which is a bit of tooling that we're working on that will make your job as a developer very easy. It's very useful. I used it in my workshop on Monday, and it doesn't matter if you're an expert developer in the modern JavaScript space or a complete beginner. This tool will make your life easier. So let's go look at the code. So first off, every Aurelia application that you build will be loaded from some type of HTML file, whether that's rendered by some type of server framework such as ASP.NET or ASP.NET Core, or it's just a completely static HTML file. Okay? When you generate an application using our CLI, it will give you a file that looks like this. So out of the box, you get there's 11 lines of code here. There's not a ton that we have to do, okay? But the most important lines in here are lines 8 and 9. On line 8, we have the body tag, and it has an attribute on it called Aurelia app. This tells Aurelia where you want your application to live in the browser, okay? If you don't give this attribute a value, Aurelia will use conventions to decide where to go to start loading your application. It'll go look for 2 files in the root of your source folders called app.js and app.html, and it will load a default configuration of the framework and go from there for you. You're just able to get up and started with 0 configuration. Sorry, I'm still a little parched from that boat cruise last night. But most applications are going to need some type of custom configuration, whether you're setting up some plugins or you want to set up, say, authentication providers or something like that, and you're going to need to configure that stuff before the framework itself gets started. So to do that, we give you the option of giving a value to this Aurelia app attribute. You give that value, and Aurelia will go look for a file with that name. In ES 2015, all JavaScript files are modules. So Aurelia will look at this file, which is a module, and see if it exports a function called configure. It will then call that function, and it'll pass you everything you need to be able to configure the framework. Line 9 is where we actually load up the JavaScript to run everything. We utilize require.js, which I'm sure I'm hearing some groans. It's not Webpack or whatever. Webpack is coming, but I'll tell you what, require.js is really fast, okay? But we use require.js in our CLI, and a data main says load our bootstrapper, and then the bootstrapper takes over. So let's go look at some actual Aurelia code. This is your first Aurelia view. This is our templating language here. We just use $curly brace, which comes from ES 2015. This is string interpolation, which is a new feature with JavaScript ES 2015. We like to take language features from JavaScript and put them into our view language so that the amount of context switching that you have to do as a developer is minimal. Okay, and you'll see that a couple other places in this demo. So all that this template does is just display the message. And as I'm sure you can guess, that message is hello world. Here we have a very simple class. You'll first notice there is no Aurelia here, okay? All of the configuration of the framework was done in that main.js file I talked about. And there is some stuff in here, but if you look at this, there's very little going on. I just tell Aurelia to use the standard configuration. I set up what's called a feature, okay? And then I just call start. Very little code, not a ton to do to get started with Aurelia. And so when this runs, this is what we get. And I know this is earth-shattering, right? Everybody's excited. But think about some of the frameworks you've used where it's hundreds of lines of code just to write hello world, okay? And with this, our CLI will generate it for you, and you see that it's basically 5 or 6 lines of code. If I had not used a value on that Aurelia app attribute, it literally would have been 5 or 6 lines of code, okay? So next, let's get exciting. Let's actually build something. So I'm going to replace the JavaScript in app.js with a new class called welcome, okay? In here, I've got a couple of class properties. I'm utilizing an upcoming part of the JavaScript standard called class properties to set up 3 strings. I have a getter that will take the first name and last name property and concatenate them. I know, it's crazy what I'm doing here. This is high-level JavaScript. And finally, we have a function that when you call it, it'll pop up an alert on the page. The important thing to notice here, though, is, again, there is no Aurelia. The word Aurelia, except in that string, doesn't exist on this page, okay? This is it. There is no man behind the curtain here. You see, I have these 4 files. That's it. This resources folder, that's it. There's just a configure function in there. Okay, I'm not hiding anything here. So let's create a view here. This is our view for this. You'll see on the first line, or the second line, I load Bootstrap. I'm able to require in CSS resources. You can also teach Aurelia through various plugins to be able to require in stuff, say a markdown file. If you want to pull a markdown file into your view for something, you can teach Aurelia how to do that, okay? Next, you see the string interpolation again here to show the heading of the page, the welcome to Aurelia string. And then we come down in here and we have a form element. And you'll see that we have 2 text boxes here. And both of them basically look the same. And they look like standard HTML, except that here, instead of saying value, it says value.bind, okay? This is how Aurelia's binding engine works when you're binding to HTML attributes, okay? You will see, wherever you see a period or a dot in an Aurelia view, you can assume Aurelia is going to do something. In fact, if you go look at our source code, you'll see that what it does is it goes and it looks for dots and attribute names. Value.bind gives you the default binding direction between your view and your view model, okay? The default for most things is going to be one-way data binding coming from the view model into the view. But where it makes sense, by convention, we give you two-way data binding, okay? So here on a text box, it makes sense to have two-way data binding so that you'll know about changes to the first name or the last name property, right? So the framework by default gives you that. But conventions are great up until the minute they don't work for you. And when they don't work for you, you want it to be easy to override the convention, okay? Or to be explicit. Even if you agree with the convention, you want to be explicit. And to do that in Aurelia is very easy. Here, if I want to be explicit that this is going to be a two-way data binding, I just say value.to-way. You'll notice that it popped up with IntelliSense. I'm utilizing Visual Studio Code's Aurelia plugin, which is really cool. So two-way is explicit that this is going to be a two-way data binding. Anytime you want, you can use it, okay? Can anybody guess if I wanted to force this to be a one-way data binding, how I would do that? Anybody? Come on. One way, yeah. So now this is going to be a one-way data binding from the view model into the view. So anything I type in this text box isn't going to get updated into the view model, okay? A lot of times that's what you want. For example, if you were data binding onto a class attribute or something, that's perfectly fine because the user's not likely to be updating that value. On a text box, though, it kind of makes sense for it to be two-way. We have one other data binding direction that you can use, which is useful for performance, which is the one-time data binding. Can anybody guess how one-time works? I just say one-time. I hope you're starting to notice that Aurelia just makes sense, okay? What you expect it to be is what it's going to be with Aurelia. Okay? It's a framework that's very easy to learn. In fact, by the end of this 15-minute demo, you're going to basically know 80% of what you need to know to build Aurelia applications. And that's not BS. That is true. You'll fully understand our binding engine by the end of this. Okay. All of that talk, though, I'm just going to accept the default of a two-way data binding. We come down here, we have another string interpolation. You'll see that even though this is using a getter, everything just works as you'd expect, okay? And then we have a submit button down here. So when the submit button is clicked, the form element submit event is going to get fired. So how do you bind to an event in Aurelia? Well, we have two bindings. We have trigger and delegate. Up here on this form, you see that I've got submit.trigger. What trigger does is it attaches the event handler directly to that HTML element, okay? Sometimes that's a really good thing to do. For example, if you had a click event or something, and you want to make sure you're getting the click on that one thing and you don't want things to bubble up. But a lot of times, for performance reasons, it's good to use event delegation, utilize event bubbling, and have one event handler on the page that delegates out where things need to go. And with Aurelia, it's as simple as changing from .trigger to .delegate, and now you're using event delegation. Think of when you're inside of a loop with a repeater or something, and you've got, say, a table of values, and you have an edit button on every line. You don't want to have hundreds, possibly thousands of events being created. So .delegate will get you out of that problem quite quickly. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and use delegate. And what will happen is anything here, this is a function, but anything that you pass in between the parameters will be passed to that function when it's called. And that's really nice. If I can pass in hard-coded values here, or I can pass in other values coming from somewhere else on the page or something. It is really nice to be able to do that. For example, inside a repeater, when I might have an edit function just on my main view model, and I want to pass the specific item that I'm working on, I would pass that in here. Okay, so that's a lot of talk. Let's see what it looks like. This is crazy, right? For the people who are using Aurelia, this should look very familiar. This is our skeleton application, the home page of our skeleton. So as I type here, if I change this to Joe, it gets updated, okay? And use my own last name, Grant. And if I click submit, the event fires. So that's pretty cool. Without utilizing any framework code in my JavaScript, I was able to get an application running with Aurelia. And I like to ignore the main.js because for this demo, it's just not necessary, but the CLI puts it there, so I don't count it. Okay, so that's cool. But as I talked about, with Aurelia, you build single-page applications, and this is about as single-page as you can get. You know, we don't have any other pages in our application. This is the entire application, and it's not very exciting, all right? So let's go ahead and we'll add a wrapper around this so that we can start doing some navigation within this application. So the first thing I'm going to do is change this file names from app.html and app.js to welcome.html and welcome.js. And then I'm going to come and I'm going to recreate app.js and app.html. Is that thing flickering? Are you having a problem? So it's just there? Okay. Sorry, guys. The projector's messing up. Okay, so in app.js, I've got another little bit of code here. What I'm doing here is setting up a router in Aurelia. This is how you do it. Any page that needs to have a router, whether it's the main application router or a child router, all you have to do is put a function on the class called configure router. Aurelia will see it and call it, okay? It'll pass you a router configuration object and the router itself, okay? So here we set up a single route which points to that welcome module that I just created, and then we set router as a property on our class. For those who aren't familiar with routers, routers are used for navigating around an application and passing parameters and stuff. They also enable stuff like deep linking into your application. On this HTML file, I've got a bunch of Bootstrap navbar code, which isn't very interesting, so I'm just going to get rid of it for a second and look at line 33, where we have this router view custom element. This is the first custom element that you're seeing. A large part of building Aurelia applications is building on custom elements, whether your own custom elements or, in this case, a custom element provided by the framework, okay? The router view element tells Aurelia this page is going to have a router. And a minute ago I said that whenever you export a configure router function, Aurelia will see it and call it. As a slight lie, because actually what happens is when you have a router view element in your view, then Aurelia will go looking for a configure router method. Okay? You don't have to set up a TypeScript interface and implement it or anything. You just write the configure router method and Aurelia will call it for you. Okay, so I ignored this nav bar, but let's go look at it because there is some interesting code in here. You'll see that the router's title is being interpolated in. But the more important thing here is that we have a repeater, okay? Now, earlier I talked about with string interpolation that we're bringing ES 2015 features into the view so that you're minimizing your context switching. With our repeater, we do the same thing. You see that it says repeat.for row of router navigation. The for of loop is a new feature of ES 2015 that is a for loop that works like you might expect it to on collections. So with Aurelia, we decided we will use that loop in our repeater. So for every item in the router's navigation property, we will get a new row. What is the router's navigation property? Well, any route that you set as nav true in its configuration gets attached to this. It's a great way for building exactly what we're building here, a navigation bar, okay? So for each of these items, we check if the route is active, and if it is, we attach a class called active. Otherwise, we don't put any class on the list item. And then we have a link here, and we bind the route's href property to the link's href property. Pretty simple, right? And there's one last thing we do, which is that whenever the router's is navigating property is true, we want to show a spinner. So to do that, we use Aurelia's if custom attribute. This comes with the framework. The if binding allows you to add and remove items from the DOM. Okay? Sometimes it makes sense to completely remove things from the DOM. Other times, you just want to hide stuff. We also provide a custom attribute for that called show. Okay? If to add and remove from the DOM, show to just hide things. Basically set display none on them. But here, we've decided to use the if binding. So if we go back and look, you see that now we have a nice nav bar. You'll also notice that the page we just worked with is now a page in the application. It's no longer the entire application. I did not touch the code to do this, okay? All I did was change the file name. And that's cool, but what good is having a router and having a nav bar if we only have one route, right? So let's go ahead, we'll add a second page to this application so that we can navigate back and forth between the two pages. So to do that, first I will go to our router and I will copy this route and then paste it below. And I'm going to call this new route users. So I'll say users. I'm going to point to a module called users. And I will create this module in just a second. And then here, I'll get rid of all of this. Just point to users. Okay. And then over here, I'm going to create two new files, users.js and users.html. Notice the convention there of a view and a view model being paired up and you not having to tell the framework. Okay? By convention, we look for it. But if you need to override that, you can tell us explicitly, listen, I want you to use this exact view. Or you can tell us, here's a function that will determine what file to use. Okay? You can also put your view, your template inline in the page using a decorator called inline view, and you can have single file components with Aurelia. But for this demo, I'm just using the convention. So first, here I will add in a little bit of code. Now, this is the first file in this entire application where I'm actually bringing things in. I'm importing modules from Aurelia, okay? I bring in something called inject from Aurelia Framework, and then I also bring in our fetch client. If you're familiar with fetch, it is a new type of way to do, pull in resources and make API calls, make HTTP calls. It's supposed to replace XML HTTP request, AJAX. And then I load a polyfill for fetch because it's fairly new and not all browsers implement it. Next, I use the inject that I decorated here, or that I imported here, to decorate our class. Decorators are an emerging standard in JavaScript that will be part of the language very soon. Pretty much every modern JavaScript framework uses it. Angular 2, Ember, us, we all use it. And I use this to tell Aurelia, I want you to inject a dependency for me, that dependency being our fetch client. Aurelia utilizes constructor injection, so I write out a constructor, and in the constructor I configure this fetch client to tell it that its base URL is going to be GitHub's API. And I set that as a property on my class. Then I have a function called activate. This is part of Aurelia's router lifecycle, okay? When you have a page that's being routed, Aurelia will look on the module and say, does it have an activate method? Does it have these certain lifecycle methods? And if they're there, Aurelia will call them. If they aren't, Aurelia just moves on with its day. And the great thing about router lifecycle methods is that they are promise aware. You can return a promise from one of these methods and tell the router to hold off until you're finished doing whatever work you need to do before the page can be loaded. So with activate, when Aurelia goes to activate a page, first it will see if you have this function, it'll call it, and if you are, like in this case, returning a promise, because fetch is a promiseified API, Aurelia will wait. So we can wait to load the page until our call to GitHub has completed, okay? Nothing too fancy going on here. We just ask GitHub for a list of its users, and then we set that as a property on our class, okay? Over in our view, we have stuff that you've already seen before. Remember I said that by the end of this demo, you will know 80% of what you need to know to build an Aurelia application? Well, it's starting to come true. You've already seen our repeater, okay? We're repeating over every user, okay? And then we're binding using the default binding on the source for this image to get the user's profile photo. And then we're using binding down here again to create a link to that user's profile, okay? So if we come back over here, you'll see that now I have a second link up here because I created a second route. And if I click on it, it just loads a list of GitHub's users, right? But now we have two pages. We have a full navigable Aurelia application, okay? And I did this with a minimum amount of Aurelia-specific code, okay? I think that's really cool because I like when a framework lets me tell it what to do, not when it tells me what to do, okay? The other thing I like, though, is doing dumb things on stage, doing things that I would never do at a real job, okay? I feel like demos need to have people do something dumb, like where you're sitting in the audience going, why are they doing that? I would never do that. So I'm going to do that. What I'm going to do is show off how in Aurelia, every single page that you create is also a custom element, okay? So here, back on this page that we first created, our welcome.html file, what I'm going to do is I'm going to, here at the bottom, add a custom element called welcome, okay? I'm on a page called welcome and a module called welcome. By convention, Aurelia says, okay, if you want to use a custom element from this module that's called welcome, the file or the custom element will be called welcome. Because I'm already inside that page, that resource is already available to me without having to require it in like you saw me do with CSS before, okay? So I've got a recursive page here now, okay? And if I were to save this, it would cause my browser to crash. In fact, I'll show you. So I come here and I go to the welcome page. You see that it tried to go to welcome and then it failed. And you probably won't be able to see this, but if I pull up the error message here, down here, maximum call stack size exceeded, which is obvious. I had an infinitely recursive page, right? So we don't want that. So what I'm going to need to do here is I need to put some way for the user, for me, to say, okay, I want you to add that to the DOM, right? Remember back to our nav bar where I used the if.bind on the spinner to add and remove things from the DOM? That's a very useful thing for me to have right here. So what I'll do is I'll create a checkbox that will determine if this thing should be in the DOM or not, okay? So input type equals checkbox, and then checked.bind, or sorry, not check.bind. What I'm going to do is use ref, okay? Ref equals do dumb stuff. Now what this ref attribute does is it takes this HTML element and makes it a property on your view model, okay? That means it's able to be used in your JavaScript code, but it's also able to be used in my view, okay? So I'm going to take that, I'm going to come down here, I'm going to say if.bind equals do dumb stuff dot checked, okay? Save the file, come over here, and now everything loads, okay? So as I click the checkboxes, the recursive page continues to be recursive, right? But the problem I have, if I'm doing dumb stuff, I like to do dumb stuff. I want to go all out. And the problem I have is that when I type my name here, it's not going down the page, right? Like, let's do this right. So what I'm going to do is I want to bind this page's first name property to the custom elements first name property, right? So to do that, I would say first dash name dot bind equals first name, okay? This isn't going to work yet, though, because I have to tell Aurelia that the first name property is bindable, okay? So let's go ahead and do that. I'll come over to welcome.js, and I will import bindable from the framework. And then that is a decorator, just like we saw with the inject decorator being set on the class. Well, the bindable decorator, in this case, is going to be set on this property. So I just say bindable first name. That's it. I come back over here, and I set a couple things. And now, when I type my name, it goes down the page, right? That was pretty cool. That was really, really easy, wasn't it? I'm sure a couple of you, though, are wondering why it says first dash name equals first name, right? Well, HTML is case insensitive, okay? So in Aurelia, we have to have a way of translating between JavaScript property names and HTML attribute names. And the way we do that is we convert from JavaScript's camel case to HTML, what we call kebab case or dash case. I call it kebab case because kebabs are delicious, right? But let's go back over here and notice something, which is the data only goes down, doesn't come back up, right? And again, I can't reiterate this enough. I like to do stupid things. So I want the data binding to go in both directions. How do we do that? Does anybody remember how I force a binding to be two-way? I just say to-way. And now, this becomes a two-way data binding. Okay? Pretty cool, right? So I took this page from being the entire application to being a page in the application to being a custom component in itself. That's pretty awesome, right? But I have one more trick up my sleeve. So I'll go ahead and close these two files. And I'm going to come back to app.html. And you remember, with app.html, I said I have this whole boatload of navbar code. And it really, I don't feel like this fits here. I want to componentize my application, so I want my navbar to be its own component, right? But the thing is, there's really no behavior with this. It's all view logic that's going on. It's all specified in the view. Okay? So it'd be really nice if I could create a component or a custom element without having to go and write any JavaScript for that. Well, with Aurelia, that is possible, and I'll show you how. I'm going to create a new file here called navbar.html, and inside of it, I'm going to create a template element. One thing I failed to mention is that all Aurelia views are wrapped in the template element. This is a part of the web component spec, and it's really nice because it gives you HTML that the browser will not parse until you tell it to. Okay? So we utilize that in Aurelia. And I'm going to come back over here. I'm going to take out all of that code and just paste it in here. And that's nice and all, but the problem I have is that I have this repeater that's repeating over a router, and I have a property called router that I'm doing data binding to. So I need to be able to bind to that property. But remember, I don't have any JavaScript code, so I can't go and import that bindable decorator. So I need a way of doing that. Well, what we came up with is an attribute, a custom attribute on the template element called bindable. And you could add a comma-separated list of properties that you want to be able to data bind to. These are always going to be one-way data bound. The only way you can override that is with our two-way data binding. But we'll come in here, and I'm going to say bindable equals router. I'll save that. I come back over here. Now I do need to require in this thing. Require, again, is how you pull in external resources, external from your view. So I say nav-bar. In this case, I'm going to put .html. The .html tells Aurelia this is an HTML-only custom element. Okay? And then I just say navbar router.bind equals router. And I've got that. So if I come back over here, everything looks the same. But what's cool is that if I come here and inspect, I scroll up just a little bit, see that now I have a navbar element in there. Okay? I've completely removed the navbar from my main view, and I didn't have to write any JavaScript to do it. Okay? So what is it when you're able to do these things? You're able to take a page from being the entire application to being a page in the application to being a custom element inside itself. What is it when you're able to create a custom element without writing any JavaScript code? What is it? I call it magic. I wish I had music every time this plays. Okay, so that's it with the demo. That's the demo you've probably already seen. For everybody watching online, now comes the cool stuff that you haven't seen before, because it's now time for something completely different. And I don't have the explosion like Monty Python had, but stick with me here. Who here has written applications utilizing modern JavaScript frameworks that were not Aurelia? Maybe Angular 2 or something. Okay, yeah, lots of you. Have you heard of something called hot module reloading? Okay, it's a really, really useful feature. Webpack enables it. Okay, and you noticed I was using our CLI here in this demo, and every single time I would save a file, the page would reload and I'd lose all of my state. And that can be really frustrating when you're trying to debug code. Well, we heard you, and we are finally getting hot module reloading out there. So I have here our navigation app. It looks very familiar, right? And it doesn't have, oh yeah, the first name's down here. You can see I've already been playing with it. So this one here, by default, everything is set as John Doe. But I'm going to change this to be Ashley, okay? And then I'm going to come over to Visual Studio Code, okay? And I'm going to take this here, cut it from there, and paste it up here. And then I save it. And when I come back over here, in just a second, there it goes. It just hot module reloaded that for me, okay? This is not something you can do with our CLI today. We hope to implement this soon. But this is something you can play with today. If you go to our skeleton navigation repo on GitHub and pull that down and then go to the TypeScript experimental or Webpack experimental branch, you can play with this today, okay? This is a very important feature for lots of developers, and it's something that a lot of people said wasn't possible with MVVM-style frameworks because we have state that's inside of, we don't have a single source of state and everything. But I'm here showing you it is possible, okay? And this is going to be part of our official release very soon, probably within the next couple of weeks. This will be officially released. Now, the other thing I want to show is something called server-side rendering. Server-side rendering is very important for both initial render speed on a page and search engine optimization. Is everybody familiar with what server-side rendering is for JavaScript frameworks? Yeah. This has been a failing of Aurelia for a long time. We did not have a server-side rendering story, and people would complain about this. And so we listened. And I'm here to show you for the first time. This literally didn't get finished until last night. Basili, our Webpack guy, got this up and running. This is a server-side rendered Aurelia app. Okay, and I'm going to prove it to you because first here, this application is not using server-side rendering. And if we go and look at the source that was shipped over from the server, see it's very short. This is a Webpack version of what I showed you before. It's only 20 lines of code. But if I look at this application and look at the source, you'll see that the entire application is being rendered here, okay? So we have our first name and last name and everything. For some reason, my scroll bar isn't working very well. You will notice that I switched over to an Ubuntu VM. One of the dependencies that we utilize to do hot module reloading for some reason doesn't work on Windows right now, but it does work just fine on Mac and Linux, okay? But you're probably thinking this is still fake. I hand wrote this or something. Well, if I go over to my terminal, eventually, I have, there we go. Okay, so here I have a server running on port 8765, and you can see where it's outputting everything from Aurelia as the browser loads up everything, okay? As the server takes Aurelia's JavaScript code and renders it, it spits this out. When you run Aurelia just in the browser, you get the same sort of stuff. This is the development logging that was configured on main.js, okay? And so if I come back over to Chrome and I refresh the page, you'll see that it just refreshed, and I have another thing there. So this is not smoke and mirrors. This is actually Aurelia being rendered by Node.js, okay? Server-side rendering is a bit of a funny story, okay? There are some frameworks, their server-side rendering is just what I showed you here, where they spit out HTML into the browser, and then in the browser they let the framework start up, and then they just swap the DOM, okay? And that's nice, but sometimes you get a bit of a flash as the DOM elements get swapped out. So our goal with Aurelia is that our server-side rendering in the next month or two, we're going to give you the ability to basically hot start the framework. Aurelia will be able to look at what the HTML and the state that the browser created when it rendered the page initially, and hot start. It will take that and get started up, and it will take over that DOM, okay? We also hope to queue up events. Like if a user clicks, so it takes the framework, a couple milliseconds, 50 to 100 milliseconds to get started,
In that time, it's possible that a user could have already clicked a button or clicked a link that the router needs to deal with. We want to queue those up so that when the application does get started in the browser, we're able to get moving with that. Our goal is to have the best server-side rendering story of any modern JavaScript framework, okay? And again, you guys are literally the first ones to see server-side rendering outside of the Aurelia team. I went on the cruise last night down the Thames, and when I got back, Basili got back to me and told me he had this running. And so it was at midnight last night that I added this to the demo. Okay. So I have obviously convinced everyone because you're all jumping and cheering. Sorry, it's not on microphone. You can't hear it on the video. But anyways, so you want to know where is the framework now and where is it going to be going, right? So what's the current status of the framework? We released version 1.0 back in July of 2016, last year, okay? We've continued working on it. The framework is fully featured. You can use this to build real applications, okay? In fact, I will show you some real applications that are on the internet just in just a minute. I'm getting close on my time, but I have a couple of minutes. Our documentation site is awesome, okay? I will tell you how awesome it is. Rob Eisenberg, who started Aurelia, had the idea for how we were going to create our documentation, and we implemented it as a team. Okay, you can go there. It has some really cool features, like it has a who am I or what is my role option, and you could say that I'm a developer, and we give you everything about the browser. We give you the technical documentation and everything. Or you can say, for example, I'm a manager, I'm a CTO, and if you choose CTO, we give you like small words and things that are easy to understand. Okay. And this was so awesome that Microsoft saw it and they hired him. Rob is now working at Microsoft on docs.microsoft.com. Okay? He still works on Aurelia. In fact, the framework is stronger than ever with Rob at Microsoft. Okay? I promise you, don't worry about Rob being at Microsoft. I'm super excited about the future. As I said, real applications in development and in production. I'll show you a couple in just a minute. Do we have anybody in here that speaks Norwegian or Swedish? Awesome, because that's going to come in handy in a minute. Okay, we are currently working on enhancements for our CLI. We're going to be integrating Webpack and hopefully System.js and JSPM into the CLI so that you can utilize the great power that comes with Webpack from our CLI. It'll be great for people who don't want to learn all of the configuration necessary to really get the power out of Webpack, but they still want that power. As you just saw, server rendering. We're always working on bug fixes. If you submit issues on GitHub, we try to fix them as quickly as possible. All right. Thank you, but I'm not done. Really quickly, I would like to go to my browser, and I'm going to pull up Aurelia's blog. Because just this morning, we published a blog post of a case study from the Nordic Cinema Group. Okay? And if we go here to this, okay, Norwegian or Swedish. I think I'm on the Swedish site. Okay, but this is an Aurelia application. You can choose, it's Swedish because it's Gothenburg. Okay, so we'll say we're in Gothenburg. This is like Fandango. Okay, you can go and buy theater tickets. This is a movie company, and they sell them. Okay, it's a beautiful, beautiful application that they're going to be launching into production very soon. Okay, and you see that they have. One thing to notice here is that there's not a pound sign up here. Okay, they're utilizing the Aurelia router's ability to work with modern browsers to server or something. Anyways, to not have to use hashes for routes. Okay, so that it looks just like a standard URL. Okay, but we could also come over here, and I want to see Moana. In English, it's Moana. Okay, and I can choose stuff. And just to prove to you that this is Aurelia, I will inspect this.
And you see AU target ID. And somewhere up here. Yeah, you'll see like ref equals and stuff. This is an actual Aurelia application, okay? People are using Aurelia. Large companies are using Aurelia, not just Nordic cinema groups, okay? There are tons of people out there using Aurelia. Just last week, I was talking to a developer who was working with one of the largest automobile manufacturers in the world, and he was telling me about the work he had been doing at that manufacturer with Aurelia, okay? So anyways, I'd like to thank you guys for coming out. I welcome feedback. Please drop lots of greens in the box outside, okay? Also, if you want to give me feedback via text, go to my Twitter. It's on here. You can send me messages on Twitter, okay? So, thank you.